Ladies and gentlemen, while you're arranging your croissant and filling your coffee cups, I'd just like to say, first of all, good morning and thank you very much for coming here at such a bright and early hour. I'd like to make a few words of explanation, first of all, about the Food Security, Safety and Sustainability Task Force, which is part of the European Committee of the British Chamber of Commerce. You may have noticed around the room that actually there's an awful lot of non-Britishness here, and we're very proud of that. The task force was set up by the Chamber in recognition of the importance of issues of food security, safety and sustainability, and in recognition of the fact that these are some of the most important challenges facing mankind and our future on this planet. What we wanted to do was to create an environment where stakeholders and experts and representatives of organisations in the Brussels community could meet on a regular basis to talk informally and to have an informed debate and get to know each other. And from that point of view, we're very pleased and proud to welcome you here this morning at a time where dialogue is so important. We normally operate under Chatham House rule. However, by agreement with Sir John, we're not doing that this morning. So this is on the record. Anything that's said this morning can be repeated outside, and that's actually something we normally don't do. We normally respect the Chatham House rule for our events, but we're very pleased to be able to have the chance to be on the record today. With that said, I would like to introduce our sponsor, and that's the Crop Protection Association from the UK, Dominic Dyer. Dominic is Chief Executive of Crop Protection Association. He's also the chairman of a charitable organisation, Care for the Wildlife International. Dominic, thank you very much, and I hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, and welcome. It's a real pleasure to be able to sponsor this event today and to welcome Sir John Beddington, someone I know well and we work closely with in the United Kingdom. I think the report you have on your table, the Foresight report, looking at the future of global agriculture and food production, is probably one of the most important pieces of research, in my view, that's come out, not just from a UK perspective, but for the world at large, in terms of global food security and the threat that we all face. It's a crucially important issue. John's going to take us through some of the key findings of the report, and no doubt some of the key elements in terms of what solutions might be for the future. But just want to pick up on one or two key points, I think, for us to reflect on this morning. We have already in this world today over 1.2 billion people that face starvation, have over 1 billion people that are facing malnutrition. But at the same time, and many of us in this room might fall into the category, there's 1 billion of us who are probably over-consuming on food. So there are some real issues and real challenges for us to face in the food chain. We're aware of this sort of perfect storm scenario that John and others have been talking about over the last few years, of a massive increase in population, maybe to about 9.5 billion by 2050, that ever-growing demand for land, water and energy, the demand for food to go both into food supply chain use but also into biofuels as well. And we also are aware more than ever, I think, about those so-called unknown unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld used to speak about the huge sort of implications of weather patterns and changes we've seen in the Ukraine, with problems with the heat wave, which had a big impact on wheat prices in the last 12 months. We've seen floods in Pakistan, and in recent weeks we've seen the tragic earthquake and tsunami in Japan, and radioactive problems with their power generation systems as well, that could have an impact on the food supply chain in the future. And as a conservationist, as well as someone who works in the plant science industry, I think we're all too aware of the impact on biodiversity and wildlife in general of farming and agriculture, from Brazil to Madagascar to Indonesia to Africa. We're seeing the impact on endangered species and on the biodiversity of this planet, which is under greater threat than ever before. So we have huge, huge challenges, and I think this report is very timely. It sets out some key areas, looking at how we can harness more agriculture technology, how we can minimise waste, how we can balance that demand and supply in the food chain, and how we can look at the governance of the food chain, from subsidies to trade barriers and other issues that we need to address, even though they might be very difficult politically. I just want to come on, before I finish, to the European Union, come back to Donald Rumsfeld, and come back to a book I've recently been reading by Bob Woodward on the Iraq War and its aftermath, and it was called State of Denial, and I sometimes think that's what European Union is in when it comes to the food security debate. We have some big issues here, but often policymakers are still stuck in a mindset of the 1980s and 90s, of cheap supply of food mountains, of intervention buying, of export refunds. We probably haven't moved on in the way we should do. But it's important that we do look at what the challenges Europe faces. There is a real productivity gap in Europe. OECD figures recently reported that we might see productivity increase in agriculture in this part of the world by about 2 to 3% over the next 20 years, compared to about 15 to 40% in other parts of the world where technology is being used more widely. We have some of the most rapid rising food prices in the world in this continent. In the UK, we're seeing average price increase over the last 4 months of around 6.7%. In places like Germany, we're seeing around 4.5%. So we're seeing raging food price increases and we're seeing falling productivity. And already Europe has a country the size of Germany that meets its demands for importing food, which has huge implications for the global environment and sustainability as well. So we can't shut ourselves off from the reality of the food security crisis. A number of issues I'll flag up, and no doubt John and others might pick up on it later. We still don't have an EU chief scientist. It's been talked about for over 12 months. We have a growing sort of hazard-based system of regulation in terms of agriculture and food supply issues, which is reducing the level of crop protection technologies, also increasing the barriers to GM technology, and as we've seen in the papers today, also a debate on cloning, which is becoming increasingly restrictive as well in terms of food production systems. So we do have to step up to the challenge in this continent. I think it's very important that John's here today, not just talking to us as the food chain, but also talking later on to EU policymakers, MEPs, and people from the European Commission as well. And I'm very pleased to see that President Sarkozy, as chairman of the G20, is going to have a summit of all agriculture ministers in Paris in June. He's putting this at the top of his agenda. I hope this report is going to be on the table of ministers for that event. If nothing else, recent events in North Africa, where we're seeing the sort of food security and national security agenda come together, is something that we all need to be thinking about as well. So this report is timely. It's terribly important. As Paul says, this is probably one of the biggest challenges that face mankind in the next 30 to 40 years. You've got a real expert here for today, a real privilege to have a bit of John's time before he goes to talk to policymakers as well. So thank you very much. Welcome, John Beddington. Thank you.
Dominic has mentioned some of the issues I want to raise, and I think one of the things that I want to emphasise, and it's coming in the first slide, is that actually this is a unique time in human history. I'm sure everyone says that, but actually it is. If you look at graphs of world population, everything shows the world population growing exponentially. It goes from 1 billion in medieval times to the 6 billion we see now. But for once, there is actually a real degree of consensus that the world population is going to peak. Now, is it going to peak in 2050 or 2060? Is it going to peak at 9 billion or a little more or a little less? Clearly debate and uncertainty about this. But one of the things that is almost a consensus, and demographers are as tough to reach a consensus as economists. I think it was Priestley who said, if you laid all the economists in the world in a long line, they still wouldn't agree. An interesting visual concept, by the way. But demographers now come to a consensus that, by and large, the world population is going to peak, and it's going to peak somewhere towards the middle of this century. Now, that gives us an enormous opportunity. It's an enormous opportunity because it does mean that we're not facing that inexorable exponential increase in population and demand for resources, but also there are very significant threats. So there's an opportunity to actually operate in a sustainable world that feeds enough people properly, that actually has sufficient water and energy, and indeed takes care of the climate of the planet. So that's the opportunity, but clearly there's a lot of threats. And in the terms of the threats, Dominic has already stolen my thunder by referring to some of the speeches I've made in the past. So we have a convergence of threats. Dominic's pointed to some of them, but the threats are really, despite this flattening of the world population, which is shown from 2000, if you actually look at the graphs and actually say, what are the units here? The world population is still going up by about 6 million a month. It's going to continue to do that until about 2050 or 2060, when the total population will be somewhere around 9 billion. In addition, there's some big drivers and trends which I've pointed to in the past. One is an increasing prosperity, that the consuming power, particularly in the developing world, is increasing substantially. That's not to forget, and I'll come on to the problem of poverty and hunger later, but that increasing prosperity is real, and we're seeing that, and it's the sort of demand we're seeing, particularly from South Asia, but also South America, not just for food and for higher value agricultural products, but also for complex manufactured products. And that demand is going to go on, and there's going to be a demand for for energy as well. People focus on food poverty, but there's well in excess of 1 billion people who have no access to electricity. These are the demands that as the world changes, and these are the challenges. So in the context of this particular report, I put out the challenge in general to the Foresight team and said, let's look to the future of food and farming and pose the question, how can we feed 9 billion people sustainably, equitably and healthily? And that was the challenge I put out to the team. Now, the first thing they came back with was 3 messages. That you need a radical redesign of the global food system. No action, no change is not an option in the current situation of threat and food security issues we see, but that the policy and decisions outside the food system are critical because the food system is failing. First of all, it's failing on sustainability. Agriculture is currently over-consuming water. It's over-consuming water from our rivers and streams, but it's also over-consuming water from aquifers. And much agriculture is actually using for irrigation water that is certainly hundreds of years old in terms of its residence underneath the ground, but in some cases thousands of years old. And this is not a developing country problem alone. It's a problem in the southwest USA. It's the problem in the Middle East. So we have got to address that water issue. So the current way that we run our food system is not going to work because aquifers will run dry, water and stream management is not working, and 80-odd%, 85% of the developing of water in the developing world actually goes into agriculture. World average is about 70%. We can't afford that. We need to be thinking of smarter ways to deal with the issue of water. And in terms of, it's also failing in terms of sustainability. Land, about 25%, 24% is spurious accuracy, I would have to say, in this context. But the estimate is 24, but about a quarter of all land has undergone soil degradation due to human activities in the past. So it's failing on that ground, and we need to address it. And thirdly, it's failing in the sense that agriculture is producing something of the order of 10 to 12% of greenhouse gas emissions. And if you look at land change, that figure rises to 30%. But perhaps the most important area that it's failing is in terms of humanity. This is a slightly complex graph. First of all, the blue line is showing the number of people in millions who are actually genuinely hungry. And you can see the effect that food price spike in 2007-8 had in increasing the number of people who were actually in poverty and actually going to bed hungry. That went up in that period with a slight time delay, the time delay only to be expected, by 100 million people. And if you look at the purple line, this was, in a sense, the proportion of the world's population that was actually hungry. And as you can see, up to about 2000, there was a reasonably satisfactory decline in that figure. But as you can see, that has reversed. And following the food price spike, an increase in the proportion of the world population that has gone undernourished. And the green dotted line is the Millennium Development Goals, which, as you can see, show little possibility of being met now. So those are, as it were, the challenges and the issues that were posed in a stark way to the Foresight team. And I should explain a little bit about the Foresight report. It's very substantial. We had several hundred contributors. There was a lead expert group led by Charles Godfrey, who's actually an ecologist from the University of Oxford. And there was a high-level stakeholder group involving British ministers, but also representatives from the World Bank, FAO and others. The publication of the report is very substantial. You have in front of you the main report, and there's a summary which runs to, I've just been quoted as saying it ran to over 100 pages. It just seemed like that when I read it. But in fact, it's 44 pages in the executive summary, which is still quite substantial. And there are substantial reports. And so the the CD that you actually have on your table has all the material and the backup reports, and this is very substantive. All of this has been published, but it's there available for you. So let me go down to describe some of the results. There are 5 challenges that the team posed as a subset of the main challenges. And I'm not going to dwell on this slide because I'm going to go through each of those key challenges one by one. So the first one, which is balancing future demand and supply sustainably. As we saw, the problems in 2007-8 were the first time there'd been 3 or 4 decades of declining real prices, and that was a shock in 2007-8. And the point about consumption, the point about increasing wealth, the point about increasing population, and the third area being increasing urbanization, all of those point towards a need to actually improve and address the balance of supply and demand. Now, one of the things that I think that has shown the myopia, the short-sightedness of our community over the last 30 years or so has been not a recognition that some of the things we do need to be done better. First of all, there's an enormous gap between what is attainable from the best farming practice. This is the top graph gives you an example for wheat, and what would be actually obtainable on average in society. And those yield gaps need to be filled by actually improving current practice. It doesn't involve research. It involves using what the UK term is extension services, going out and actually educating the farming community how to do things better. But of course, we also need to focus on new methods of producing more. We need to be research in agriculture has declined almost in parallel with the decline in real prices, and so that has been a problem because research results do tend to take a while to actually come through, typically about 10 years. And one of the things that we need to recognize is that and it seems to be an enormous truism, but we're not making any more land. We can make more land by chopping down tropical rainforests or ploughing up perennial grassland, but we do that at our peril due to the production of greenhouse gas emissions from such practices, but also the undermining of the world's biodiversity, which I'll comment on, which happens. So we need to be thinking, and the trite phrase, and it's not so trite actually, is we need sustainable intensification of the agricultural system. And there's some ways also of there's low-hanging fruit. First of all, waste. There's 2 different sorts of waste, depending on whether in the developing world or the developed. In the developing world, something of the order of 30% of all crops are lost due to pests and diseases before harvesting. In the developed world, as the top left graph indicates, about that level is actually wasted after the consumer have purchased it. So those 2 levels of waste are ways in which if we could eliminate that waste, both in the developing and the developed world, in the developing world by better agricultural practice, by dealing with pests and disease, and by dealing with storage, very important, we need to think about it. But in the developed world, we also need to be thinking about ways in which we can actually address that waste problem. So there is a lot to be done there, and in a group like this, this is the sort of thing that can usefully be done. But we also need to think about better governance. The issue of international trade, the issue of how we actually operate in an interconnected world needs to be thought about. And production subsidies, the problems of restriction of trade in agricultural products, and the continued developments of the Doha round are difficult. And one of the analyses that that the group did, which is shown here, was they looked at the change in price that would actually happen after a particular shock, for example, a major drought or a significant level of flooding, what that would happen. And as you can see, the change in prices vary differently across the world. The change in prices that would come from a shock, if there were trade restrictions, and i.e. that we have business as usual, are a problem. And as you can see, albeit that there are increases in China, India, NAFTA, the big increases also come, and Europe in particular would see a significant increase and would benefit therefore from an improvement in trade. But the second challenge is volatility. This graph shows the sort of problems that we started to address. Historically, and really since about 20 years ago, the price mechanisms of major commodities are such that the supply and demand have not produced significant volatility. But since 2007-8, we have seen that volatility start to increase. And there's a variety of explanations for that. One of the key ones is to do with reserves. 2007-8, world reserves of major cereals were at a 40-year low, at around 14% of consumption. If you can multiply 365 by 0.14, that's how many days reserves we actually had at the tail end of 2007-8. Answer, well, I'm not going to ask people to do it exactly, but it's somewhere between 50 and 60. Let's not be too detailed here. But those reserves are really important. And actually, interestingly enough, is since 2007-8, reserves have actually gone out, but those were not tradable reserves, because in fact those reserves were in China and India and reserved for home consumption. So this again goes to the issues of how important international trade is. And we need to be thinking a little bit about how we deal with this volatility. Now, one of the ways that volatility could be done would be to think about physical reserves. Now, the last thing that the report is recommending is some UN-based grain, lamb, beef, oil, and dare I say it, wine mountains. That is the last thing we're recommending. But we do believe, and this is already being tried in Southeast Asia with rice, that regional reserves may well be a very sensible way of dealing at a small scale. And I was in Washington about 3 weeks ago. We just discussed it with the World Bank. We discussed it with IFPRI, and some of the experiments that are actually happening in Southeast Asia, which is trade agreements to trade and some degree of reserves in rice, have meant that in 2010-11, whereas all the other major cereals have shot up in price and some of the related products like sugar, rice has not. So I think there are things to be done in terms of that. And we need to be thinking about how we address the volatility at the level of the farmer. We need to be thinking about insurance systems, because financial intervention can actually help there. And we do need that safety net for the most vulnerable. As I said, in 2007-8, 100 million extra people went into abject poverty. So let's turn to hunger. Where is it? Well, that's the pie diagram on the left-hand side that shows where it is. By and large, it's in Asia and the Pacific and Africa. In terms of proportions, Africa significantly higher. But also, there's this hidden hunger, and the Venn diagram on the right-hand side shows the way in which abject hunger, i.e. going to bed genuinely hungry, links in to food insecurity, links into the level of a further billion people who actually suffer hidden hunger. Insufficient appropriate minerals and vitamins and other nutrients into the diet so that both physical and mental capacity is reduced in the development of the individual. So how are we going to do that? You know, hunger's been with us a long time, and I think the report makes some points here. We need to be thinking more in terms of greater priority for addressing hunger. It is a scandal, I believe, that climate change, which is enormously important, has much greater coverage in our press unless you actually get a famine than hunger. And one of the suggestions, and there are a number of ways that agriculture can help to end hunger, some of these are illustrated here, particularly empowering women, social protection policies. But one of the ones I'd like to focus on is we should be able to, with modern technology, think about updating our hunger index. If we can say that in 2007-8, 107 million extra people went into poverty, we should be able to document that, if not maybe monthly, but certainly quarterly. And we also have the capability of saying, where is that hunger occurring? So a world hunger map that was published every month, by a UN organisation and saying, this is what has happened in the last year, we believe would focus that. And we think it is really important to focus that, because the international community has got lots of challenges, but many of those are, in a sense, it was the problem of Bob Geldof. Bob's moved on, he's getting quite elderly now, a bit like me. These are problems of the history, but they're not. They are absolutely contemporary, and we've got to recognise that those are issues. So the fourth challenge is the challenge of low emissions. And I think here there's a really odd phenomenon. Agriculture is both a threat to climate change, but it also is is indeed threatened by climate change, but it's had a very low profile in the international discussions on climate change that have occurred. So, for example, if you look at those international negotiations, agriculture has not been included. The Copenhagen Accord agreed a 2-degree target, no legally binding agreement, of course. More than 70 countries produced emission reductions, more formal agreement following at Cancun, and there's the meetings coming up this year in Durban. But no work plan on agriculture was not included in those wider climate change discussions. And I believe very much that there is a real opportunity here. We need a climate-smart agriculture. We need to be thinking, and what do I mean about climate-smart agriculture? And I'll get through this lot quickly. We need to be thinking about things that can be done in terms of carbon sequestration. It is possible to develop plant material which will actually sequester carbon dioxide into the soil. Plant breeders know how to do this, not necessarily involving genetic manipulation, but understanding plant genomes. We can think about ways that we could actually sequester carbon. Different policies of actually using a sort of agroforestry also have potential. And one of the things that is interesting, forestry has properly had a high profile in the climate change discussions. Improperly, agriculture has not. If we, in a sense, we analyse what is happening in forestry programs in the climate change agenda, that we are paying countries not to chop down trees. We are paying them to forego a benefit, because chopping down trees generates capital and it generates extra land. It has a potential. And we are paying, the international community are paying to stop that happening. And that's proper. That's completely proper. It is a sacrifice that we're asking of countries like Brazil and the Congo not to chop down their trees. But in agriculture, if we could incentivize climate-smart agriculture so that we would have farming practices that sequestered carbon dioxide or fixated nitrogen, and had agroforestry practices in agriculture, we're in a win-win. We're not paying people to actually make a sacrifice, we're paying people to actually make more money. And there's this World Bank is pushing this, and there's some areas of West Africa where this is already being trialled, and farmers are being paid to actually adopt agricultural practices which are actually climate smart. They actually improve the sequestration of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, and at the same time also provides high productivity. And if you actually ask about the scope worldwide, there's a lot more farmland than there is forest. And if we think about the scope here, so one of the things that I'm doing, and I'm the climate change and agriculture and food security. There's an international commission which I'm chairing, which is it says what it says on the tin. It is international. It has both developing and developed countries. It has a mix of skills, and we're going to be reporting in to hopefully to the Durban summit on the need to bring climate smart agriculture way up the agenda of the world community. So the final challenge that I want to talk about is about biodiversity. And in a sense, that's one of the things that is very high on the agenda within the European community. In a sense, we are wealthy enough as a community to be able to afford it. Other parts of the world don't have that ability. But we need to be thinking about biodiversity. We don't want a world in which there is no biodiversity, because that actually will not be successful. Because biodiversity and food security run hand in hand. We cannot solve a problem of food security or water security or energy security unless we also understand that we need to protect ecosystem services and biodiversity. So a new framework, there was in Nagoya last year, they developed a new convention on biological diversity. The idea of underpinning halting species loss, reducing pollution and overexploitation, and increasing financial support on biodiversity into the developing world. An important issue and one intimately linked into the food one. So where are we now? Those are the 5 challenges. The report sets out some of the ways that actually those challenges can be taken forward. And in a breakfast meeting, it's not the time to go into great detail about particular practices. But what I'd like to, the last couple of points are, first of all, where are we now? 2011, the highest food prices that have ever been seen since records began from the FAO. You can see the price spike in 2006, 2007, where we had I was told in 2007-8, the supply system will meet it. There will be a reduction. Yes, of course, we've had a spike. We had that for weather reasons. And we saw, and Dominic mentioned it earlier, the combination of weather in Russia, China, and South Asia, and the effect on food prices. And as you can see from the headlines from the FT, you're seeing major increases in food prices. And January 2011, the highest we've ever seen. That is a system under stress. It's not going to go away. So we need to be thinking about it. This is where we are moving. So we have this issue, and Dominic referred to it. When food prices go up, there is a real issue of fundamental instability. And one of the reasons that is there is that it's the other trend that I mentioned right at the very start, that urbanization. 2010 was the first year that more people lived in cities than in the rural environment. And the projections into the future are that by 2030, well over 60% of what will be 8.3 billion people will be living in cities. For example, in Africa, the expectation is much of the population increase will go into medium-sized cities of about 500 million people. Similar expectations in Asia, but the size of the cities is closer to a million rather than 500,000. I'm sorry, I'm getting my statistics wrong. So these and those urban populations are the most vulnerable to food. In the rural communities, there's famine food. You have the potential for actually adapting to what is severe scarcity. In the cities, you don't. And of course, the cities have the political power. They also have the potential for causing unrest. This is not to say that North Africa was the problems in North Africa were caused by the rising food prices, but they are factors in social and governance instability. So finally, what would I say to you guys? You're the private sector. This was written at late on yesterday, and so but I think there are some things that the private sector needs to focus on. Needs to focus on greater sustainability. Interesting spelling of greater, by the way, you may notice in the first slide, which indicates the late hour that this slide was put together. We need to be thinking about developing appropriate sustainability metrics. We need to be thinking about clear and simple food labelling. I think one of the issues that I would expect to happen over the next 5 or 6 years is that water will come into food labelling. The issue of virtual water, the fact that much of the world, often without water, is with water shortages, is exporting products to a world which is not short of water. And I think water labelling may well be something of the future. And we need to be thinking about food waste. That has got to be addressed throughout the food chain, whether in fact it's thinking about private sector investment in better pest control, better disease management in the developing world, or better control of product in the developed. Thank you for your attention.